fourth lecture in the series on the science fiction or fiction of H.G. Wells. And the book I'm going to be covering is The Island of Dr. Moreau. Island of Dr. Moreau was written 1 year after The Time Machine. Time Machine was written in 1895. Dr. Moreau was written in 1896. The title of this lecture is The Beast Within, the Death of God, and Barbarism. It sounds complicated, but actually this book is probably the most deeply philosophical and most difficult to understand of all of H.G. Wells' books. And what's interesting, of course, is that many people have heard of The Island of Dr. Moreau, and generally speaking, their view of it comes from the 3 movies that have been made about it. And one of the purposes of this lecture is kind of to set the record straight as to what the actual thematic content of the original book was. This is the original cover, and kind of a portent of something horrible and evil, which is what the book is about. And I like this. This is a more modern cover for the book. And interestingly enough, and I covered this in a previous lecture, is the cover painting, which is one done by Gustav Moreau. And it's my contention that the hero of this book, The Island of Dr. Moreau, is actually a takeoff on Gustave Moreau, who was a painter and of Oedipus and the Sphinx, and what they call chimeras, half man, half beast, which is a principal theme in H.G. Wells' work. So that's good to kind of see that. Most of the ideas around H.G. Wells' book, The Island of Dr. Moreau, comes from the movies. So I thought it'd be a good idea for us to go through the popular versions. And let's just say, begin with the idea that the fundamental plot of The Island of Dr. Moreau is, the text is of a novel, is the narration of Edward Prendick, a shipwrecked man rescued by a passing boat who is left on the island home of Dr. Moreau, a mad scientist who creates human-like hybrid beings from animals via vivisection. So that's the common concept of what the book is about, and that's been sustained through all the different movies. So in the first movie to come out about the Island of Dr. Moreau was a book that came out called The Island of Lost Souls in 1932, and that starred Charles Laughton and Bela Lugosi, which is kind of a cool thing. And supposedly this movie is the closest one to the original feeling of the novel. Now, in 1977, there was another movie made, The Island of Dr. Moreau. This is with Burt Lancaster and Michael York, and that was in 1977. And then the third movie that was made was The Island of Dr. Moreau in 1996, and that was with Marlon Brando and Val Kilmer. And this movie was such a disaster, the 1996 version, that a movie was made about the making of the movie, which was called Lost Soul Island of Dr. Moreau, The Doomed Journey of Richard Stanley, who was the director. Now, I just came across that there's another TV series planned of Dr. Moreau's, Island of Dr. Moreau, and I found this on the internet, and here's the way they introduce it. The double helix wasn't even a twinkle in Watson and Crick's eye when H.G. Wells first wrote The Island of Dr. Moreau. But his 1896 novel proved astonishingly prescient about how unlocking the secrets of DNA would open the door to humanity playing God with the natural world in strange and frightening ways. And now, in the shadow of the CRISPR revolution, it felt like the perfect time to revisit Moreau and bring it into our own 21st century world of transgenic animals, designer babies, and other scientific advances Wells never could have dreamed of. So the common theme in all of these ideas is that The Island of Dr. Moreau is about a mad scientist. That's the basic idea. And I'm here to declare today that that's not what it's about. And how are we going to establish that? On the internet, everybody is giving a review and their opinions of what's going on. And naturally, I could just give you my opinion, but I prefer to evidence my opinion with certain facts and prove to you that that's exactly what's going on. So the first article of proof is what H.G. Wells said about at least one of the movies when he was around, The Island of Lost Souls, 1932. So Wells criticized the film as a, quote, as a mad scientist travesty of his satire of Victorian anxieties about degeneration and the cultural forces keeping us precariously human. So what he's saying, I mean, point blank is, no, it's not about mad scientists. It's about his worry about whether civilization could sustain or survive potential barbarism. Now, the H.G. Wells of this period, this picture here, is around 1930. And in 1924, there was a compilation of all his work up to that time. He had already been quite prolific. And it was called the Atlantic Edition. And in this was in 1924, and he wrote a preface to The Island of Dr. Moreau during this time. And this preface, I think, gives us a pretty good indication of what he was intending. So H.G. Wells' commentary is this: it is a theological grotesque, and the influence of Swift is very apparent in it. There was a scandalous trial about that time, the graceless and pitiful downfall of a man of genius. And this story was the response of an imaginative mind to the reminder that humanity is but animal rough-hewn to a reasonable shape, in perpetual conflict between instinct and injunction. Key words here are between instinct and injunction. The story embodies this ideal, but apart from this embodiment, it has no allegorical quality. So, what is the trial that he's talking about here? So don't forget, the book was actually written in 1895, and at this time there was a famous trial going on, and that trial was the trial of Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde and Lord Alfred Douglas. And I've talked about this in one of the previous videos. So this is a trial that took place because Oscar Wilde was a homosexual, and he was ostracized and sent to prison and died, I believe, in 1899. So this was what Wells is saying. This was his response to the trial going on at the time. Trial was going on in 1895, and this book, The Island of Dr. Moreau, came out in 1896. So we have to keep that in mind. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here is that the H.G. Wells of 1895 is quite different. I mean, he looks quite different than the one that I showed you a picture of in 1930. Here, Wells is approximately 30 years old, and he's just written The Time Machine, and he is a writer. He actually has two different facets at this time. He's writing science fiction, and at the same time, he is also writing some speculative articles, philosophical speculative articles, that are sort of expanding some of the thinking going on post-Darwin. Darwin publishes a famous book on evolution in 1859, and there was a lot of controversy in terms of what it implied. And Wells was one of those people that took up the subject and wrote quite a bit about it. And as you can see here are some of the science fiction books that he wrote, and here are some of the articles that he wrote at the same time for a magazine called The Fortnightly Review. And if one reads some of these articles, you can see the ideas that are echoed in the book itself. And we're going to see that very readily in The Island of Dr. Moreau. Here's a very good quote from that time. This was from the Fortnightly Review in 1896 in an article called Evolution and Ethics, Human Evolution and Artificial Process. And in this particular quote, he mentions The Island of Dr. Moreau, so that kind of gives us another hint or indication of what he was intending. In civilized man, we have one, an inherited factor, the natural man, who is the product of natural selection, the culminating ape, and a type of animal more obstinately unchangeable than any other living creature. And two, an acquired factor, the artificial man, the highly plastic creature of tradition, suggestion, and reasoned thought. In the artificial man, we have all that makes the comforts and securities of civilization a possibility. And in this view, what we call morality becomes the padding of suggested emotional habits necessary to keep the round Paleolithic savage in the square hole of the civilized state. And sin is the conflict of the two factors, as I have tried to convey in my Island of Dr. Moreau. And this is very similar to the previous comment that he made about the trial as he describes it as a conflict between instinct and injunction, that is sin. So let's not forget the most important, I'm going to come back to it during this lecture a number of times, this description of Wells of his book as, quote, a theological grotesque. This is very, very key and a touchstone for understanding. So we can see this right away that he does not talk here about scientists going crazy or anything like that. It really has very little to do with science, this book, even though that's what's been grabbed on. What it's all about is this idea that Wells had, which is the idea of the artificial man versus the natural man. The natural man is, of course, our savage ancestors that once and still, in a sense, are evolving. And the way they're evolving is by the artificial factor, which Wells would say is education, morality, religion, artistic endeavor, society. This all controls the savage from creating chaos and barbarism in the society. Here's another quote from one of the articles that I think is pertinent. In the former paper, it was suggested that morality is the padding of suggested emotions and habits by which the round Paleolithic man is fitted into the square hole of the civilized state. Indeed, if the reader will consider the matter, the whole form of the social organization, the shape of our civilization, is nothing more nor less than the algebraic sum of the artificial factors of its constituent individuals, a fabric of ideas and habits. Civilization is not material. Very, very important idea. Civilization is a set of beliefs, according to Wells. If in a night, this artificial, this impalpable mental factor of every human being in the world could be destroyed, the day thereafter would dawn indeed upon our cities, our railways, our mighty weapons of warfare, and on our factories and machinery. But it would dawn no more upon a civilized world. And one has instead a, quote, grotesque picture of the barbaric people wandering out into the street, into their night gear, their evening dress, or whatnot, as chance may have left them at the coming of the change. Insurgent and pugnacious, turning their attention to such recondite weapons as the modern-day city affords, all for the loss of a few ideas and subtle trick of thinking. So this is the fundamental theme. And now we can tie things together a little bit and realize that the theme of the Island of Dr. Moreau is actually the same theme as that of the Time Machine. The Time Machine is about a failing aristocracy as represented by the Eloi and the surging barbarism of the troglodytic people, the Morlocks. That, of course, is, again, the artificial versus the natural. And we have to remember that in the 1890s, what they usually call fin de siècle, the end of the century, there was an overriding sense of decline, of decaying order. And that's what the Island of Dr. Moreau has in common with the Time Machine, except from a little bit of a different perspective. Here, the making of mankind involves the development of the artificial factor. What would happen to civilization if the artificial factor is removed, particularly the belief in God? So that's where, that's the connection between these two books. And here's a series of questions that I believe that Wells is bringing up in the book, that he's presenting to the viewer. Number one, what is the natural order of things, and what is man's role in it? This is a result of Darwinian evolution asking all sorts of new questions about how society is formed and how humans develop. What is the difference between man and animal, especially after Darwin's theory of evolution? 3, what is the civilization and how is it maintained? 4, what is the nature of religion, and specifically religious rules and the deity? Most importantly, what is sin? And 5, what is barbarism, and how is it expressed in modern civilization? One thing we can say here clearly is that his concern is not about the madman using science to create all sorts of monstrosity. Up to now, I've talked about 2 aspects of The Island of Dr. Moreau. The first aspect was The Island of Dr. Moreau in popular culture in terms of the movies that have been produced. And the second aspect that I've talked about is what Wells himself thought about. Actually, one of the movies, the 1932 version, but more particularly what he had to say about The Island of Dr. Moreau. Clearly, this is not the usual theme about the crazy or mad scientist. And so now what we're going to do is talk about the book proper. And of course, here's the original cover of the book in 1896. And this is the table of contents. There's 22 chapters. And what I've done is I've tried to divide the table of contents into 4 features. The first 6 chapters, and then the next 10 chapters, and then the next 17 to 21, next 4 chapters, and then the final chapter. The importance of the first 6 chapters is that Wells is introducing the concept of what Chris Dante in his book Animal Fables After Darwin calls biological existentialism. And biological existentialism is basically the idea that if you believe in Darwin wholeheartedly, that really changes your whole concept of cosmology, especially in terms of human evolution. The book starts off with 3 men in a dinghy after a boating shipwreck, and they're fighting for survival, between the 3 of them. And 2 of them pass, and then one of them survives, and the guy that survives, his name is Prendrick. And I want to read you this quote. I think I've mentioned this before in the previous video, but it's an important concept. Biological existentialism. The geologist Charles Lyell wrote in 1859 that to accept evolution fully was to go the whole orang. For Lyell, going the whole orang, a play on the expression to go the whole hog, meant painfully foregoing the biblical idea that humans were created separately from the rest of the animal kingdom. To go the whole orang meant not just to treat humans scientifically, but to go all the way to making them animals like the rest. One of the ways in which the post-Darwinian literary writer might go the whole orang or think the animality of the human without recourse to a divine order. Suggested in this book is to produce animal fables. As I will show, the rise of the biological sciences in the second half of the 19th century provides writers with a new material for the fable, new ways to exploit the grotesque comparison of the human and the ape. There's another critic who, in fact, said the way to think about animal fables after Darwin is apes writing about other apes. The style of The Island of Dr. Moreau, and especially in the beginning, is what they usually refer to as a naturalistic style or journalistic style. And of course, it's the way Wells presented this is as if this was a story that you could look it up in the newspaper or whatever. And he starts off on February the 1st, 1887, the Lady Day was lost by collision with a derelict when about the latitude 1 degree south, longitude 107. So all this, of course, is all made up. And he actually gives a referral, a source referral, the Daily News, March 17, 1887. And So the story is set in a very realistic framework to give the reader a sense of ground. And in the first chapter, chapter 1, in the dinghy of the Lady Vane, he says, I do not propose to add anything to what has already been written concerning the loss of the Lady Vane. As everybody knows, she collided with a derelict when 10 days out from Callao, that's in the Pacific off South America. The longboat with 7 of the crew was picked up 18 days after by HM gunboat Moreau, and the story of their terrible privations has become quite as well known as the far more horrible Medusa case. The Medusa case is an interesting reference here because the Medusa was a painting done by Theodore Géricault in 1819, and it told the story of 400 people that were involved in a shipwreck. Only 2 survived, but the stories about the whole shipwreck involved a great deal of cruelty and cannibalism. And there's only 2 people that actually survived the whole ordeal. So this reference, in a sense, to almost cannibalism is par for the course for Wells. He actually mentions cannibalism in just about every one of his early books. The other aspect of biological existentialism is that there is no particular virtue even in being saved. So that here, when Prendrick is thanking the person that saved him, his name is Montgomery replies, if I may say it, you saved my life. Chance, he answered, just chance. It's only chance, I tell you, as everything is in a man's life. Only the asses won't see it. So here, again, this is the setting that Wells is setting up. The first 7 chapters, in fact, are all the elements of what's going to be happening when Prendrick eventually winds up on the island. And here it talks about being on the boat. Before going off to sleep, Prendrick notices Montgomery's assistant, who does not seem human. Over the taffrail leant a silent black figure watching the stars. It was Montgomery's strange attendant. The creature's face was turned for one brief instant out of the dimness of the stern towards this illumination, and I saw that the eyes that glanced at me shone with pale green light. The thing came to me as stark inhumanity. So again, this is the element of what's about to be the brutes, the animals that Dr. Moreau is trying to turn into humans. The other aspect that's going to be developed later is the captain of the ship eventually decides to throw everybody overboard. And in this, he insists upon his rights as the captain of the ship. I am the law. You're going overboard, I tell you. Law be damned, I am king here. And that's a very important aspect, as we'll soon see, as Dr. Moreau also kind of echoes that same kind of concept. They're cast adrift by the captain, and now Prendrick is out in a boat. Prendrick is saved once more, but this time by an older white man and his 3 assistants, whose faces, quote, gave me a queer spasm of disgust. And Prendrick asks, what could it all mean? A locked enclosure on a lonely island, a notorious vivisector, and these cripples and distorted men. So this brings us, right, in a sense, really to the beginning of the story. I wanted to mention here as well, this setting of the island and the horror is also typified in William Golding's Lord of the Flies. And it just so happens H.G. Wells was Golding's most favorite author. And now, in chapter 7, in a sense, this is really where the book starts. Who is Moreau? And Prendrick remembers, it sent my memory back 10 years, the Moreau horrors. Was this the same Moreau? He had published some very astonishing facts in connection with the transfusion of blood, and in addition was known to be doing valuable work on morbid growths. Then suddenly his career was closed. He had to leave England. A journalist obtained access to his laboratory in the capacity of a laboratory assistant. On the day of its publication, a wretched dog, flayed and otherwise mutilated, escaped from Moreau's house. It was in the silly season, and a prominent editor, a cousin of the temporary laboratory assistant, appealed to the conscience of the nation. it was not the first time that conscience had turned against the methods of research. I would contend that this is actually Wells's position, and he had not very much against vivisection or even some of the unpopular research methods that were occurring in the late 19th century. So Prendrick suddenly, he's in the house and there's a locked room and he hears the crying of the puma and he doesn't really know what's going on. Wells describes it in terms of the book. The crying sounded even louder out of doors. It was as if all the pain in the world had found a voice. So Prendrick is forced to leave. He escapes out of the house. He can't take it, basically. And while he is outdoors or outside in the forest or the jungle, he at first notices something that's shocking. Something. At first I could not distinguish what it was. It bowed its round head to the water and began to drink. And then I saw it was a man going on all fours like a beast. It seemed that grotesque ugliness was an invariable character of these islanders. I could hear the suck of the water as his lips as he drank. Suddenly, as I watched their grotesque and unaccountable gestures, I perceived clearly for the first time what it was that had offended me, what had given me the two inconsistent, conflicting impressions of utter strangeness and yet of the strangest familiarity. The three creatures engaged in this mysterious rite were human in shape, and yet human beings with the strangest air about them, of some familiar animal. Each of these animals, despite its human form, its rag of clothing, and the rough humanity of its bodily form, had wove into its movements, into the expression of its countenance, and into its whole presence, some now irresistible suggestion of a hog, a swinish taint, the unmistakable mark of the beast. So he's out and he sees what he can't tell. Is it human or animal? And it's on all fours sucking water. Chapter 12 is kind of the key chapter now. The chapter 12 is called The Law of the Beastmen, the Sayers of the Law. After hearing human screams, Prendrick escapes into the woods and comes across a village of the beastmen. He must learn the law, announces the ape man. Then they all join together in a communal pronouncement of the law. Not to go on all fours, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to suck up drink, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to eat fish or flesh, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to chase other men, that is the law. Are we not men? Then the chant swung around to a new formula. His is the house of pain. His is the hand that makes. His is the hand that wounds. His is the hand that heals. And then other pronouncements in song. His is the lightning flash. His is the deep salt sea. His are the stars in the sky. If the law is transgressed, quote, evil are those that break the law. None escape. The beast people repeat, none escape. It's very obvious that when Wells says this is a theological grotesque, that this is a satire of religion, unquestionably. And suddenly Moreau and Montgomery suddenly appear and Prendrick again escapes. And I wanted to mention at this particular point the influence of H.G. Wells, The Island of Dr. Moreau, on George Orwell's Animal Farm. As you can see, the 7 commandments in the Animal Farm are very similar. 7 commandments, whatever goes upon 2 legs is an enemy. Whatever goes upon 4 legs or has wings is a friend. No animal shall wear clothes. No animal shall sleep in a bed. No animal shall drink alcohol. No animal shall kill any other animal. All animals are equal. That's from Animal Farm. 4 legs are good, 2 legs are bad. This obviously was, Orwell's book is completely influenced by H.G. Wells. At this point, Prendrick has no idea exactly what's going on. In his deep, darkest fear, he thinks that Moreau is experimenting on humans. And in chapter 13, everything is upside down, becomes upside down. When Moreau and Montgomery catch up to Prendrick, they laugh at his intentions to commit suicide. Moreau says to him in Latin, Hae non sunt homines, sunt animalia qui nos habimus, vivisected, a humanizing process. The Latin translation is, these are not men, these are animals who we have vivisected. So everything is turned upside down now, and for the reader who is not aware, you may feel a pang of relief.
But in actuality, Wells is not really talking about animals. He's actually talking about humans in terms of evolution. At the shore, the beastmen watch. The rest stood silent, watching. They have once been animal, but I never before saw an animal trying to think. So we're in this state right now where Moreau is discussing and explaining his ideas about what's going on behind his experiments. And if we go back to Wells's idea about the natural man and the artificial man, this is key to understanding Moreau. As Moreau now says, the creatures that I had seen were not men, had never been men. They were animals, humanized animals, triumphs of vivisection. Yes, these creatures you have seen are animals, carved and wrought into new shapes. To that the study of the plasticity of living forms, my life has been devoted. It is not only the outward form of an animal which I can change. You begin to see that it is a possible thing to transplant tissue from one part of an animal to another, or from one animal to another to alter its chemical reactions and methods of growth, to modify the articulation of its limbs, and indeed to change in its most intimate structure. The second part of this, though, is equally important. There's the artificial that the natural man that Moreau is working on, or the natural animal, and then there is what he also calls the artificial, which is a pig may be educated. The mental structure is even less determinate than the bodily. In our growing science of hypnotism, we find the promise of a possibility of superseding old inherent instincts by new suggestions, grafting upon or replacing the inherited fixed ideas. Very much indeed of what we call moral education, he said, is such an artificial modification and perversion of instinct. Pugnacity is trained into self-sacrifice and repressed sexuality into religious emotion. Then he goes on, I suppose there is something in the human form that appeals to the artistic turn of the mind more powerfully than any animal shape, but I have not confined myself to man-making. The store which men and women set on pleasure and pain, Prendrick, is the mark of the beast upon them, the mark of the beast from which they came. Pain and pleasure, they are for us only so long as we wriggle in the dust. In terms of the ethics of the experiments, Moreau says, to this day I have never troubled about the ethics of the matter. The study of nature makes a man at last as remorseless as nature. He continues, the human shape I can get now almost with ease, so that it is lithe and graceful, or thick and strong. But often there is trouble with the hands and the claws, painful things that I dare not shape too freely. But it is in the subtle grafting and reshaping one must needs do to the brain that my trouble lies. The intelligence is often oddly low, with the uncountable blank ends, unexpected gaps. And the least satisfactory of all is something that I cannot touch, somewhere. I cannot determine where, in the seat of the emotions, cravings, instincts, desires that harm humanity, a strange hidden reservoir to burst forth suddenly and inundate the whole being of the creature with anger, hate, or fear. They seem to be indisputably human beings. It's afterwards, as I observe them, that the persuasion fades. First one animal trait, then another creeps to the surface and stares out at me. But I will conquer yet. Each time I dip a living creature into the bath of burning pain, I say, this time I will burn out all the animal. This time I will make a rational creature of my own. After all, what is 10 years? Man had been 100,000 years in the making. This idea of making men, or to help evolve men to the next stage, is actually something that Wells writes about later in what you might call his social period, when he's writing social tracts, espousing socialism. And one of the books is called exactly that, Mankind in the Making. That was in 1902. So Moreau continues, they only sicken me with a sense of failure. I take no interest in them. I fancy they follow in the lines the Kanaka missionary marked out and have a kind of mockery of rational life, poor beasts. There's something they call the laws, sing hymns about all thine. They build themselves their dens, gather fruit and pull herbs, marry even, but I can see through it all. See into their very souls and see nothing but the souls of beasts. Beasts that perish, anger and the lust to live and gratify themselves. Of course, in this situation, who is Wells actually talking about? He's actually talking about human beings. Then we go back to the concept again of theological grotesque. A series of propositions called the law battled in their minds with a deep-seated, every rebellious craving of their animal natures. Montgomery told me that the law, especially among the feline beast people, became oddly weakened through nightfall. There are two aspects to religion, in particular in relation to God. And one is God as the creator. And here I have the Michelangelo Sistine Chapel famous picture of God as creator. And then there's the second, man as lawgiver. And my contention is that Moreau represents both of these characteristics. Moreau, in fact, is not the problem. He's the solution to the problem. So what is the problem? The problem is, as in chapter 16, the problem of reversion, barbarism. How the beast folk taste blood. Upon discovery that a rabbit has been killed, the perpetrator must be found. Dr. Moreau calls the beast people. The law has been broken. To which the beast people respond, none escape, none escape. Responds Moreau, evil is he who breaks the law. Who breaks the law goes back to the house of pain, back to the house of pain. Moreau is subsequently attacked by the leopard men. Prendrick then comments, a strange persuasion came upon me, that save for the grossness of the line, the grotesqueness of the form, I had here before me the whole balance of human life in miniature, the whole interplay of instinct, reason, and fate in its simplest form. This is pretty much a statement that what Wells is describing here is human society, in fact. Now, in chapter 17, as I said, Dr. Moreau is not the problem. He is the solution to the problem being the barbarism or the animal instincts of humankind, actually. In chapter 17, we have the killing of Dr. Moreau, and interestingly, H.G. Wells calls this chapter 17, the death of Moreau, is called a catastrophe. So the catastrophe is Moreau's death. Not the solution to the book. It is the problem of the book. The monkey man looked guiltily at the hairy gray thing. He is dead, said this monster. They saw. Where is he, said Montgomery. Beyond, the great creature pointed. Is there a law now, asked the monkey man. Is it still to be this and that? Is he dead indeed? Is there a law, repeated the man in white. Is there a law, though other with the whip? He is dead, said the gray thing, and they all stood watching us. Prendrick, said Montgomery, turning his dull eyes to me. He's dead, evidently. Lee, one of the characters, had been standing behind him during this colloquy. I began to see how things lay with them. I suddenly stepped in front of Montgomery and lifted up my voice. Children of the law, I said, he is not dead. Mealing turned his sharp eyes on me. He has changed his shape. He has changed his body. I went on, for a time you will not see him. He is there, pointed upward, where he can watch you. You cannot see him, but he can see you. Fear the law. Obviously, Wells is making a very satirical and critical statement about the force of religion in society. And the problem of what happens when the source of the law, again, possibly in theology would be God, Ten Commandments, etc. What if that's removed? What happens to society then? In chapter 20, it's called Alone with the Beast Folk. They are mad, they are fools, said the dog men. Even now they talk together beyond there. They say, the master is dead. The other with a whip is dead. The other who walking in the sea is as we are. We have no master, no whips, no house of pain anymore. There is an end. We love the law, we'll keep it. But say there is no pain, no master, no whips forever again. So they say, but I know, master, I know. It is well, I said again. Presently I will slay them all. After certain days and certain things have come to pass. Every one of them save those you spare, every one of them shall be slain. What the master wishes to kill, the master kills, said the dogman. But one has sinned, said I. Him I will kill. He is dead, the master is dead, said the voice of the ape man to the right of me. the house of pain. There is no house of pain. He is not dead, said I, in a loud voice. Even now, he watches us. So unquestionably, when H.G. Wells calls this a theological grotesque, that's exactly what it is. It is not a book about the house of horrors created by Dr. Moreau. It's actually about the reversion of mankind to a level of barbarism once God is dead, or once the sources of stability in civilization are removed. And in chapter 22, the last chapter, Prendrick says he has difficulty adjusting to civilization in London. He's back. My trouble took the strangest form. I could not persuade myself that the men and women I met were not also another beast people, animals half wrought into the outward images of human souls, and that they would presently begin to revert, to show first this bestial mark, and then that I see faces, keen and bright, others dull or dangerous, others unsteady, insincere, none that the calm authority of a reasonable soul. I feel as though the animal was surging up through them, that presently the degradation of the islanders will be played over again on a larger scale. He also makes a comment about the church. Then I would turn aside into some chapel, and even there such was my disturbance. It seemed that the preacher gibbered big thinks, even as the ape man had done. Particularly nauseous were the blank, expressionless faces of people in trains and omnibuses. They seemed no more my fellow creatures than dead bodies would be. There is a mood, however, that comes to me. Now I thank God more rarely. I have withdrawn myself from the confusion of the cities and multitudes, and spend my days surrounded by wise books, bright windows in this life of ours, lit by the shining souls of men. I see few strangers and have but a small household. My days I devote to reading, to experiments in chemistry, and I spend many of the clear nights in the study of astronomy. There is a sense of infinite peace and protecting in the glittering hosts of heaven. There it must be, I think, in the vast and eternal laws of matter, and not in the daily cares and sins of the troubles of men, that whatsoever is more than animal within us must find its solace and its hope. And that's the way the book ends. So I have a couple of comments here in terms of summary. First of all, we need to view H.G. Wells through the period he lived in, and the period he lived in is some of the post-Darwinian ideas, and also in philosophy, existentialist philosophy, the beginnings of it. Someone like Nietzsche's right around this time, Genealogy of Morals, Beyond Good and Evil, and Thus Spake Zarathustra. All these books are about the problem of God disappearing, or the concept of God disappearing in the society, and what's going to take its place. The other aspect of Wells's pessimism is his knowledge of that the progress and the optimism of the Victorian era belied the barbaric tendencies below. In this, he was simpatico with Joseph Conrad, who he was very close to actually during this period. In particular, The Island of Dr. Moreau and The Heart of Darkness would be useful to teach together, as the horror that's usually the controversial aspect at the end of The Heart of Darkness is fully explained in a way by The Island of Dr. Moreau. Maybe that's why Marlon Brando wanted to play that role, because he had played Kurtz in Apocalypse Now, which was based on The Heart of Darkness. I want to leave you with this quote by Conrad to get a sense of the relationship between Conrad and Wells. Said Conrad to Wells, "The difference between us, Wells, is fundamental. You don't care for humanity, but think they are to be improved. I love humanity, but know they are not." Okay, I know that was lengthy, but this book has been misconstrued, mistranslated, and everything else, so I wanted to spend the time going over thoroughly and in detail. Thank you very much.